Hi, everyone. I see 69 participants. That is so cool for our second MES webinar. This is something new that we cooked up this year. My name is Hillary Peterson, and I'm the president of Maine Entomological Society. At our last annual meeting, we wanted to talk about some new ideas and different things to do, and starting a webinar series was something that people had a lot of interest in anyways, but it's kind of extra great this year in the pandemic as something extra to do. Right now, the plan is to host these every first Thursday of the month yearly, kind of in the off season. Maine Ent Society during the summertime does lots of different awesome field trips. And I do think that a lot of participants here today are not MES members. And in our registration form, I did see a lot of check, please tell me more about MES. So I'll be emailing more information sometime next week to everybody. But I really encourage you to join. It's a really great group of people. We have a whole lot of fun. So with that, I'll give you off to Kathy Murray, who's going to introduce Jen.
Well, okay, thanks. We are really pleased and lucky to have Jennifer Lund tonight. She is the State Apiarist with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And I think just about every beekeeper in the state knows her quite well because she really gets around. She's a very popular speaker and she really knows her stuff when it comes to bees, but not just bees. She got a master's degree in entomology at the University of Maine. She's been working in various fields in entomology for over 20 years. I know she worked on some research projects at the University of Maine while she was up there before she came down and started working for the Maine Department of Agriculture. So she manages the honeybee inspection program with the state of Maine to help all the beekeepers, and many of you are online today, so welcome you beekeepers, help to keep their hives healthy and keep away, because you have to, keep those hives healthy, and they have their own pest issues. So she's really good about that. And she also has several of her own hives that she maintains up in Argyle Township. So that's about all I have to say. I'm sure Jen will tell us a lot more. And we're just so happy to have you, Jen. So thanks for joining us and giving us a presentation tonight.
All right, hopefully y'all can see that. Is that coming through, Kathy?
Yep.
Wonderful. So, it's so neat to see. There's a lot of faces that are and names that I haven't seen in years on this call. So I'm so happy that everybody could come in and attend. My name is Jen Lund. As Kathy said, I am the Maine State Apiarist, for those of you who have never met me. And I work for the Department of Ag, Conservation, and Forestry. And really my, sorry, I'm having a little problem with my screens here. Let's see. There we go. That's better. Now I can actually see my screen. And so what my kind of role is at the at the state is I work with primarily beekeepers and helping them with hive management, with issues that they're having. I also do quite a bit of work with our migratory beekeepers that come in for blueberry pollination. We get anywhere between 30 and 80,000 hives a year that come in from out of state. And so I take a look at those as well when they're here, to make sure that they're not bringing any diseases or pests or have any issues. Primarily what I work with is our backyard beekeepers. We have about 1,200 registered beekeepers in the state of Maine, and they maintain about 10,000 hives. And so we have a lot of beekeepers and a lot of hives, and you know, their health is really important for a lot of different reasons, you know, pollination being one of them. But today I'm actually going to talk very little about honeybees. I'm going to talk mostly about a lot of our other bee species that we have in the state, which I think are definitely interesting in their own regards. So most of you probably know that one of the big things that bees do is pollination. And so 75% of our angiosperms rely on animals for pollination. And a lot of our pollination is done by insects. So we have beetles, flies, bees, moths, butterflies, things like that. There's also some other types of insects out there that do some pollination. We do have some vertebrates, so things that have their spines on the inside, which is always weird to me. Things that have their spines on the inside. I deal mostly with insects, so I like my exoskeletons, not internal skeletons, in my creatures. We have lizards, in the Southwest that do some pollination, birds, bats, especially in tropical areas, but really in our area in the United States, mostly these are insect. Most plants are pollinated by insects. Beetles are our oldest pollinators, evolutionarily speaking. But we're going to focus today on bees, and those are in the order Hymenoptera, which includes sawflies, wasps, ants, and bees. And Hymenoptera as a group, there's over 150,000 species out there, and bees are one portion of that. And bees are categorized, they have constricted waist, they have something called a scopa or a pollen basket. They have modified mouth parts, usually for both kind of lapping or sucking and chewing at the same time. And we have about 20,000 worldwide species, 4,000 in the US, and around 276 in Maine. So we have quite a bit of diversity. And usually when I talk to people and I ask them to name me some of the bees that they know out there, I get honeybees, of course, bumblebees. If I'm talking to kids, I usually hear killer bees, which are a kind of a subgroup of honeybees. But that's really where a lot of that knowledge is in those different types of bees. But there's about 250 other species out there that are not encompassed by that, 260 species out there that are not encompassed by those two groups that most people recognize. And so there's a lot of plants, a lot of things that we eat, the things that we enjoy that really rely on bees for pollination. There's lots of colorful things that are great, full of vitamins. We should be eating them because they're good for us. But really, when it comes down to it, on this list is coffee, cocoa, and vanilla. What else do you need in life? And without bees, we would be missing those three things. And I know I'd be a very unhappy camper without them. Besides all the fruits and vegetables, coffee, cocoa, vanilla, bees are also responsible for pollinating about half of the world's oils, fibers, and raw materials. Things like cotton, flax, canola, buckwheat. A lot of things rely on bees primarily on bees for pollination. And so we would have a really, really boring diet. It would be mostly white and brown without bees. So bees are really broken up into kind of two categories, roughly broken up into two categories. We have those that are social, and those are the ones that we easily recognize, things like honeybees, where they have a queen and then they have several generations in the nest at the same time. So they have young, they have brood, they have pupa, they have adults, all kind of living in the same hive structure. There's cooperation and caring for the young that are not their own. So a queen lays all of the eggs and her daughters take care of those eggs. And there's a division of labor. So the members of the colony are doing different things at different points in their lives. And this is primarily bumblebees and honeybees have this social structure. And this represents about 10% of the species in the US. So, and that's really what we understand most commonly about bees, where the vast majority of them are actually solitary, where they don't have this cooperation of caring for young. Each female constructs their own nest and provisions their own nest. So 90% of our species don't live in these big, huge colonies that we're used to thinking about when we think about bees. So I'm going to use bumblebees here as an example of a social bee. And so in the case of bumblebees, in the spring, what happens is the overwintered queens that have already mated will come out from the place that they spent the winter. Usually it's a sheltered location, maybe an old mouse burrow or under the bark of trees, someplace that was sheltered, and they'll emerge. They will find a place to start a colony. Often these are mouse burrows or holes in logs, rotted out sections of trees. And the queen will start making these little cups of these little wax cups. And what she'll do is she'll provision them with food, lay eggs in them, raise up her first batch of young. And then once those adults emerge, her daughters emerge, they'll actually take over the care of the eggs, of the future eggs that the queen is laying. In the fall, when it starts getting, the days start getting shorter and the days are getting a little cooler, they'll produce males, so they'll produce drones that go out into the world, and they also produce queens. Those queens will find drones, mate with them, and then after our first hard frost, the original hive, including the queen, will usually die, so they'll freeze to death. And then the queens that were new that year, that mated that fall, will find a place to hibernate or overwinter, and then they will start colonies the next year. So a colony is only really 1 year in a bumblebee's life cycle, or in a bumblebee colony is really 1 year. Honeybees are a little bit different. It's similar, except for a queen will live multiple years in the same colony. So she will survive 2 to 5 years, and when she is sick or dies, she'll actually be replaced by one of her daughters. So a hive can live in the same structure for forever, hypothetically, as long as something doesn't go wrong and they can keep replacing her. In the case of our solitary bees, adult female will emerge sometime during the summer, spring, summer, depends on the type of bee. She'll go out, forage, build a nest. This one here that I'm showing is underground. So she dug this little kind of hole in the ground here, and she put in nectar and pollen, rolled it in a ball. She laid the egg on it. That egg hatches into a larvae, and that larvae consumes that pollen ball and pupates, and then usually emerges the following year. So this is how the vast majority of the bees that we have in the United States actually, this is what their life cycle is like. So I think it's important. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how we can kind of each make contributions to help our bee populations, because they are struggling. And so I think in order to be able to help them and make decisions on how we can focus our efforts, it's important to understand a little bit more about each of the groups that we have in Maine. So this is going to be a really quick overview of the different types of bees we have. It's just going to mostly be at the family level of the different types. But if you wanted more information, there's actually a really great review paper. It was written by Allison Dibble and Frank Drummond, and there was a couple different authors on it. And it was in the Northeastern Naturalist in 2018, and it really is it's a really extensive checklist of all the different bees that we have in Maine and that we've had here historically and that we have here currently. And so check that out. If you have any questions about it, I can throw it in the chat at the end, and you can grab the citation. So the first group we're going to look at is the plaster or cellophane bees. It's the callidids. And these get their name because they line their brood cells with this cellophane polyester type substance. You can see it here. So there's actually brood in this middle picture. There's brood curled up as a C, and this cellophane-like structure is protecting it from water damage, and it's also fungal resistance. So it's kind of, they're protecting their young. We have about 20 species of these and 2 different genera. So we have the Callides and the Hylaeus. So the Callides here are the polyester bees, and they're gray-white. They're about the same, a little bit smaller than a honeybee. They're very hairy. The way you can tell them apart from other bees is that if you look them straight in the eyes, as you should with any bee, give them a nice loving look, their face is heart-shaped when it looks at you. So their eyes are kind of up at the top, and their faces are heart-shaped. So it's like they're giving you a little love every time you look at them in the eyeballs. And so most are specialist feeders. They carry their pollen on their legs, and they're mostly soil nesters. We have their sister group, the Hylaeus, that are the yellow-faced bees, and they couldn't be more different. These almost look like wasps, and often they are mistaken for wasps. So they're black and yellow, or white and yellow, white and black, and they're relatively hairless, slender, they're small, and they're generalist. They don't have hairs or a way to carry pollen. So they really carry their nectar and pollen in their stomach and then regurgitate it into their nests, which are typically in twigs, plant stems, and you can get them into wooden bee boxes as well. So that's the family Colitid. And then we have the family Megachilid, which is one of my favorites, Megachilidae, or D. And these are really neat, and you can tell them apart from the other bees because they have their scopa, or the place where they carry their pollen, on the underside of their abdomen. So you can see, sorry, I have to move something on my screen. You can see this picture here. This is a Megachilid, and you can see that underneath its abdomen is all bright yellow, full of pollen. So if you ever want to wow your friends, and you're, looking at bees out on the flowers, and you see one with a bright orange or yellow underside, all the pollen is there, you can totally say that that is a Megachilid, or Megachilidae. So it's a leafcutter or mason bee, and impress all of your friends. And even if you say the scientific name wrong, just say it with confidence. That's the key to most of these things, is just say it with confidence. And we have almost 50 species of these in Maine. Not all of them are native to Maine. We do have a couple introduced species, and this is in most of the groups. We have a couple species that are not originally from the United States or not from Maine. And so one of them in this Megachilid group is the European wool carder bee. And this is, it gets its name because what it does is it collects hairs from like plants like lamb's ear that are really furry. It collects the hair and it rolls them in a ball, and it uses that as nesting material. So they're carding the wool. See, it's an adorable name. Very handsome, very big, but they're not from here. They're, like their name says, from Europe. This other one here, the blue mason bee, this was also an introduced species, and this one is introduced to pollinate some of our fruit crops, some of our fruit trees, early season fruit trees. But out of the group, the Megachilid, the leafcutter bees, these are gray, brown, usually with abdominal stripes. They're really kind of chunky, they're robust, stout, and they have, they're about typically in between the size of a honeybee and a bumblebee. They have large heads with huge mandibles, and they use those mandibles to actually cut portions of leaves out of plants. So you can see in this bottom picture, this bee is actually cutting a circle out of this leaf. And what it'll do is it'll bring back this leaf to its nest, and it'll wrap its young into that leaf. Their sister group, the osmia, are the mason bees, and they look very different. They are usually metallic blue, blue-black. They have rounded, broad heads and abdomens, and these are really important. And we have a couple introduced or managed species that we bring into orchards in order to pollinate fruit trees. So we have the blue orchard bee, alfalfa leafcutter bee, Japanese hornface bees. These are all species that we use, that we propagate in order to increase pollination for those fruit trees. These also tend to fly very early in the season. So especially in places like Maine, having a pollinator for those early season fruit trees or fruit crops, when maybe not a lot of the other types of bees are out flying, is a benefit. Then we have the sweat bees, the Halictidae, and these are some of the kind of showiest of our bees in their coloration. Some are metallic, most are brown or black, but some have this bright green coloration. They're mostly bald, some have hair, and the females will carry their pollen on their hind legs. We have 76 different species, and 2 of them, Lasioglossum and the Spicoides, are the 2 most common. The Lasioglossum is broadly known as the sweat bees, and these are going to be the ones that are most common that you see. They're black, green, blue, metallic. They tend to carry their pollen high up on their legs. So you can see in this top picture, the pollen almost looks like, if you can imagine where the armpit would be on a bee, that's almost where they're carrying it. So way up high, close to their thorax, and their back legs. I don't know why I'm showing it's like right here. And These are, they nest in sandy soils, usually flat ground, and they line their brood chambers with a wax-like secretion that makes it a little bit resistant to water and fungus. So they're protecting their young that way. Their sister group, the second most abundant group that's in Maine, that's in the family Halictidae, is the Sphecoides, and these are the cuckoo bees. And so these bees are really unique in that they're kleptoparasites. So what they do is they actually will they'll find a nest of their sister group here, the Lasioglossum, and they'll lay their eggs in there and then leave and let the Lasioglossum raise up their eggs. So they're very similar to a cuckoo bird or a cowbird. I think buffalo birds do the same thing where they lay their eggs in the nest of another bird. So they're doing it in the case of another bee. They don't construct their own nests because they don't need to. Most of them are this black color on the top, on the thorax and head, and then the abdomen is a reddish orangey color. And they don't forage for pollen, so they don't carry pollen, but they do drink some nectar to keep up their energy because it's hard work finding somebody else's nest to lay your eggs in. And then the andrenids, this is the family that we refer to as the miner and sand bees. We have about 56 species of these. They're about a little bit smaller than the size of a honeybee, and they look. Some of them species look pretty similar. They're kind of black and yellow, striped. This one here has a little bit more yellow coloration on its thorax. They're soil nesters. Sometimes you'll find them in really large aggregations. If they find a spot that's really suitable for their young, a lot of bees will use that. The females carry their pollen high on their hind legs. You can see in this bottom picture that the pollen's up higher on the leg in the back. And these are some of the very first bees to emerge in the spring. They fly at very low temperatures, and you'll often see them emerge around the same time that the trout lily is peeking up out of the ground, and they'll be hovering really close to the ground looking for all of those early, small, low to the ground blooming flowers. They're also really important early season pollinators for things like blueberries and fruit trees. And then the very last group, this is a really kind of small, uncommon group. We don't see them very often. They look similar to adrenids, but smaller. And these are called the oil collecting bees, or the melitids. And they're kind of interesting. We have 4 species, 2 in each of the different genera. And this one group, Macropsis, is really interesting because they are strongly tied to loosestrife, to yellow loosestrife, and they use the oil, and they use that to line their cells, their nest cells, and they also mix that oil with pollen to feed their young. And so if you don't have yellow loosestrife, you typically won't see this bee around. They're very linked. So, as you've probably heard, if you've looked at any social media at any point in the last 2 years, that some bees are definitely experiencing problems. Not all, it's kind of a mixed bag, but we are experiencing some bee losses there. So this on the left is a kind of a paper. It was a review paper of the relative rate changes over a 140-year period for different bee groups. And that line, the dotted line that goes across, is a 0% change. So this is not changing at all. Any of those boxes, these are each of the different groups. Each of these different groups along the bottom. If the dark line is below that, the populations are decreasing. If the line is above, the populations are increasing. So you can see some bees are doing well, some are not doing well. We recently had our first federally listed bumblebee species, the rusty patch bumblebee. There are a couple more bee species, well, at least one, and then maybe the monarch as well, that are looking to be on the docket for federally listing in the near future. We used to have rusty patch in the state of Maine. It was found here, but the last time we have seen it is, I think, 2009 in the Springs area. So we have not seen it or picked up populations since then. We're pretty sure it's extirpated from the state. And so we are definitely losing some species. And there's lots of reasons why this is happening. It's not just one thing. It's a whole host of different things. We have pathogens and pests are a big one. So I'll use an example from honeybees because it's a pretty good one. So we have our honeybees are struggling. We have a large loss of hives every year. Luckily, most beekeepers can make up those losses over time, but it does get expensive, and it's not great for our bee population, our honeybee population. But the driving factor of most of those losses is actually a mite. So it's a mite called the varroa mite that jumped from a different species of honeybee onto the one that we manage. So there's several different species of honeybees. We manage one of them, the Western honeybee, and this jumped from another species called the Asian honeybee onto ours. And this is a really large mite compared to its host, and it feeds on the fat bodies of the bees, wrecks their immune system, and then infects them with virus. And this mite is really, really large. I have an example right here. So if you made honeybees as big as we are, and the mites scaled up at the same level, they would be this big on us. This is the size of my face. This is actually a stuffed varroa mite. And so you can imagine that can be devastating to a bee population if they have 1, 2, up to 10 of these on them. There's also competition from invasive bees. So if you remember that really handsome bee that I showed you, the wool carder bee that takes the hairs off the plants and rolls them and uses them as nesting material, that is actually, it's a really neat organism, but it's highly competitive for forage area. So what'll happen is a male will stake out a territory. It's very similar to hummingbirds. If you've ever watched hummingbirds defend a feeder where you have one that chases off all the other hummingbirds, it's the same thing. A male, one of those wool carder bees, European wool carder bees, will find an area that has lots of good forage and will defend and kill or chase off any other bees or butterflies or any other insect that comes into that territory. And so they can be really stiff competition to our native bees. There's also reduced genetic diversity. So a lot of our bees are very specific in the type of nesting material that they need. So the type of soil that they nest in. And those are not found all throughout the state of Maine. They're found in spotty areas. And so you can sometimes get these kind of bottlenecks of the genetic diversity for some of these populations. And then finally, a big one is loss and fragmentation of habitat. I would say this is probably number one or number two. And this is both in forage and nesting sites. So we're really fortunate in the state of Maine. We are more forested than we have been historically, which is great. Unfortunately, forests are really not great habitat for bees. They need open areas, they need sunny areas, and they need lots of great flowers and pasture land. And so, unfortunately, because of our increased forestation, that is also fragmenting the habitat that they can utilize. And then finally, climate change, or not finally, but climate change is definitely a big impactor. It has a huge impact on bees. We're getting more frequent extreme shifts in weather. If you remember, a bunch of these species are nesting underground. If we get 4 inches of rain in an hour, in some of these storms, this is what we're getting, that will drown and flood those bees that are pupating under that soil. And so really extreme weather events can knock out whole populations of bees. We also have shifts in phenology of flowering plants. So historically, bees would emerge the same time as the flowers that they were foraging on. We're finding that over the last 20 years, 30 years, that they're not lining up nearly as well as they used to. Sometimes things are flowering sooner, bees are not emerging, or bees are emerging sooner and there's nothing to feed on. And so we're not seeing that sinking that we used to. And then also there is this issue with reduced nutritional content in pollen. So there was a study a couple years ago that showed that historically, so for bees, goldenrod at the end of the season, so that's usually August, September, is one of the last big pollen sources for bees. And it's really important. And so they looked at the protein content of pollen from, in ice samples, core samples from a long, long time ago, and they compared it with protein content of modern day pollen in goldenrod, and they found that it's got a third less protein content than it did historically. And so that means the bees have to forage a third more to in order to get the same nutritional content. And they link this back to rising atmospheric CO2. So when plants get an excess abundance of CO2, they get nice and big and flush, and they grow lots of green leafy material. But they spread their resources out differently. So over time, this nutritional content, the protein content of this pollen has definitely decreased. And then finally, there's pesticide exposure. Pesticides, there's a whole group of them called insecticides. And if you were unaware, bees are insects. And so insecticides can kill bees. So it's really important to be careful when you're using them, only use them when you need them, and make sure that you're following the labels really carefully. Don't spray plants that are in bloom, use the least toxic material that you can at the lowest dose to achieve your goal. And so it's really important to use those things carefully when we want to think about helping out bees. So this is a really long list of things, and a lot of them are big issues, like climate change. That's a big issue. Pathogens and pests, it's a big. Competition, it's big. But there is one thing that every single person can do that really does make a huge impact, and that is providing forage and nesting habitat. It's really simple, really easy, and it has a huge impact. So for bees, what they need for food, for forage, is nectar. They use the sugar and the amino acids, and they need pollen for protein. Especially, they need the pollen to produce young. That's primarily what they're feeding their young, is that protein, that high protein content pollen. Most gather nectar from several different species. It depends mostly on the tongue length and the skill of the bee. So bees that are smaller and have smaller length tongues can only access nectar reservoirs in smaller or shallower flowers. Those that have very long tongues, like a bumblebee, can get into deeper flowers. Pollen collection is a little more selective. Some use anything, some focus on more than one, or on just a couple species of plants. But having a variety is good. You're going to collect. That's the key. So when you're looking at flowers that are bee-specific flowers, you're looking for flowers that have bilateral symmetry, where if you cut them down the middle, they look the same on both sides. They have a tube-like or bell-shaped, or they are tube-like or bell-shaped, and they have a nectar reservoir. So their nectar is kind of at the bottom of the flower. Bees really enjoy that. Bees also like a little bit of a complex flower. So they like kind of working for their food. Maybe they don't like it, but they do it. So an example is bumblebees and blueberry flowers. So if you look here in this picture on the right top picture, you see a bumblebee and a blueberry flower. And so if a honeybee goes to a blueberry flower, remember, honeybees are not from the United States. They were brought in to the United States. They are not originally from here. So they did not co-evolve with blueberries. So when a honeybee goes into a blueberry flower, they go in and they kind of tear it apart, and they try to get to the nectar and the pollen, and they just kind of make a big mess, and they're not really super efficient at it. With a bumblebee, since they are from North America as well as the blueberry, they co-evolved. What bumblebee does is it will hang upside down for the plant, and it will vibrate at a certain frequency, which will release the pollen and nectar, which will fall down on the bumblebee, and then it can just kind of groom it off, pack it away, and move on to the next one. So they're much more efficient. They know this behavior. You can see it with bumblebees often. You'll see it on tomatoes. So if you grow tomatoes, you'll see the bee hang upside down, and you'll see it shake really quickly. And that's it vibrating at a certain frequency to release that pollen and nectar. Bees prefer yellow, white, blue, or purple flowers. And those that have UV markers. So of course we can't see what a plant looks like under UV light, but bees do. And a good example here is right in the middle on the top middle slide or picture. That is cinquefoil, which is a really common, boring looking flower as far as we're concerned. Most people don't plant it in their gardens, but to a bee, it looks like this under this picture right below it. So it's got this bright red mark in the middle that says, this is where the nectar is, this is where the pollen is. Looks very different. Dandelion, same thing. So this is a picture of a dandelion and then a dandelion under UV filter. So this is what a bee looks, what it looks like to a bee. Bright red in the center, saying this is where the food is. So let's see what else we got here. So in order to plan a bee garden, you really want to use native plants or well-behaved non-native plants. So you don't want to plant things that are going to be invasive, no Japanese knotweed or, you know, anything that's going to get out of control. You want to plant those native, well-behaved non-native plants. You want to plant a diversity of plants to support a variety of pollinators, not only just bees, but having butterflies and other pollinating flies and beetles in your garden. Those are all great. There's also, you want to plant a minimum of 3 blooming plants at any given time throughout the year. So if you have a lack, if you have a ton of stuff in the spring that comes up and then nothing for 2 months and then a couple things that come in at the end of the season, those bees are not going to stick around. So you want to make sure that you have something blooming, at least 3 things throughout the year. And you want to plant it in clumps. Remember I talked about blueberries and bumblebees and how they kind of have to do that shaking behavior, that vibrating behavior in order to get the resources. With that, it's, they have to kind of learn to do that as they're moving around the system. So if they go from blueberry flower to blueberry flower to blueberry flower, they don't have to kind of relearn it in between. Where if they went from blueberry to lilac to orchid or something like that, they would have to figure out how to utilize that resource each time. And it makes them less efficient at gathering food. So planting in clumps where they can access a bunch of the same flower at the, you know, in quick succession is really important. And you want to have differing heights. Some of our bees are teeny, and same goes with some of our fly pollinators, really small. And they may forage only, you know, 10 or 15 feet from where they're nesting. And they don't go very high off the ground. Whereas our bumblebees or our honeybees will forage for 2 miles away from their house. So having things that are high up and things that are low to the ground benefits both types of foraging. This is not from our area. This is from Minnesota, and then one from Washington State. They just had really nice kind of visuals on them, where you can see that there's all these different things blooming in May, and then March, April, May, June, July, that you have something blooming throughout the season is really important. Great example of clumping here. So we have, you know, sunflowers and fennel, yarrow, lavender, verbena. I would love to see this in person. It just sounds gorgeous. This is a good example too, where, you know, we have poppies up here, some mock orange, we have some apple trees in the background, huckleberries, all kinds of different things kind of clumped in these gardens. Again, this is a vegetable garden. It's a community garden, but also they have these flowering plants along the outside so that they attract pollinators in here to pollinate their vegetable plants as well. So besides some place to eat, bees need a place to live. And so most of our bees are ground nesters. So about 70% of them you'll find nest in the ground. In stems or tube-like structures or beetle burrows. So you can see here is a good example. These are megachilids or megachilidae, some sort of leaf cutter. You can see that the pollen on the underside of their abdomen and the leaves that are covering the holes. And this is what it looks like inside one of those tubes, the egg, pollen. This is a little bit of mud, egg, pollen, little bit of mud, capped by these leaf pieces. And then there's a couple species, a handful that are cavity nesters and these are mostly our social bees, the ones that have a queen and lots of workers that are doing all the bee business in the hive. And they need a large area to live in. So they tend to be in old animal burrows underground or in hollows in trees. So this middle section here, this is a bumblebee with a ground nest and then a hollow of a tree. So if you're looking to support ground nesters, I am going to give you the easiest thing you can do in your yard. You know that spot that you keep getting asked to plant grass on and it never grows grass? Just leave it there. Like, you're supporting the bees, your solitary bees. They'll nest in that area. This is, so this was an area, this top picture, you can see all of these little holes. These are all bee nests. Little tubes. Each one of these is a single bee's nest. And this was an area that kind of grows grass a little sparsely. It's a little too sandy to do that. If you just leave it, the bees are there. It's great. This is outside of a warehouse. This area was probably, I would say, maybe 50 by 50 foot, so not very big. But we stopped counting the number. Each one of these little spots is a nest with the soil sticking up. And we stopped counting this at, I think it was like 2,000 nests in this very small area. So if there's a nice area for them, they will utilize it. So those bare spots that are in the yard, the paths that the dog has worn out where they just keep walking over the same area, leave those. Don't try to reseed them. You're helping the bees. You can also maintain an area by reducing the shading and the vegetation. They typically like open sunlight. If you ever want to see kind of ground nesting bees, solitary bees in action, you'll often find them nesting in places like sand pits at golf courses. So the sand traps. Actually, several golf courses in the Portland area have nesting bees that nest every single year in their sand traps, and they put up signage and they talk about them, and really they stop all their applications at that point just so that they don't disturb the bees. So it's really neat. You can also find them often at gravel pits or sand pits, so old abandoned places, often shooting ranges as well, which is kind of a weird one because they often will put pile sand as backdrops in those sort of areas. So if you're ever looking to see them in action, those are some places to look, is golf courses, sand pits, and old shooting ranges. Just not when people are shooting. And then your cavity nesters, keeping your dead trees, snags, fallen logs on the property. Those are all really great areas for bees to nest in. I am giving you, so this is the key of this presentation. I am letting you be completely lazy with your house and lawn maintenance, or your lawn maintenance and property maintenance. You keep up your snags, your fallen logs, don't buck them up, just leave them out there. Don't reseed those dead grass areas. They're great. You can plant bunch grasses. Those sometimes attract bumblebees, mostly because they attract rodents, which make nests, and then the bumblebees use those nests. You can also set up nesting boxes for bumblebees. I did not ever think that this worked, and I had a couple beekeepers that I work with set them up, and they actually got bumblebees to nest in them. And so it's really simple. You put a little box under the ground. It could be wooden or plastic. Make sure that there's holes in the bottom of it though, so it drains. You don't want to get water collecting in there. A tube to the outside. I've had people make the top of this plexiglass so you can see through it, and then a rollback kind of fake turf over it so you can peel back and look in, which is really neat. But I had beekeepers a couple of years ago, several of them, that called me and they're like, they finally found it. And so they have them nesting in there pretty regularly now, most years. And if you put horsehair, cotton batting in there, that makes it more attractive. And then for our stem nesters, any plants that you can have on your property that have pithy or soft-centered hollow stems. So things like sumac, box elder, elderberry, raspberry, allium, asparagus, sedum, sunflower, anything that has those kind of hollow, pithy stems. When those stems break, the bees will actually go in there and nest in those stems. So you can just leave the standing stems year after year, and eventually they'll fall down. The bees will emerge the following year. Or if you do want to do some yard maintenance, so for instance, on your on your raspberries, cut those canes, those dead canes, you can kind of bunch them up, just put them off to the side near kind of the edge of the yard and let them emerge. And then the following year you can dispose of them. You can make nesting blocks with holes in wood. They're really easy to make. You want to use preservative-free wood, stumps or logs. You have varying size holes. You want to have them closed at one end, and you want to make sure the holes are smooth. So you don't want them jagged because that will tear up the larvae or the adult bees when they're emerging. You can also use straw or stem bundles, stem or straw bundles. So you can see here in this bottom right-hand picture, this is just a bundle of, I think these were sunflower stalks that were cut up and bundled together, and this can be a place for bees to nest. You can get creative. Pretty much if you use a model of a birdhouse here in this middle and just fill it with stems or little pieces of bamboo and drilled pieces of wood, that can be a nice little cute one. This up here in the corner, these PVC pipes, that's the style whenever I talk to elementary school classes or school classes, this is the project that I do with them. It's a really inexpensive, it's just paper straws, PVC pipes, and then you can have the students paint the outside of these and then hang them up at their houses. You can get really intricate, see this old stump? You don't have to get it out of your yard, just make it into bee habitat. Or you can even make bee hotels. So these are some really nice bee hotels that are at different places. This is actually the top right one. This is on the top roof of a building. This is the roof here, and then this is the wall to the next building that they just built this into. This is in France. This is actually means bee hotel, and it's got lots of different things going on. I think this one's UNE's one, if I remember correctly, or maybe it's New Hampshire. You can even make them if you work for or volunteer at a nature preserve or as a trail steward or something like that. You can actually make learning centers that focus on increasing awareness of our pollinators out there. There's a really good example of an insect hotel at the Tidewater Farm in Falmouth. They've had it there for a couple years, and they get a lot of insect visitors. It's actually just broadly an insect hotel. Tidewater Farm. It's one of the cooperative extension properties. Maine cooperative extension properties. I think it's Tidewater Farm in Falmouth, which is really nice. So I actually have a bunch of fact sheets that I'll send to Hillary about the bees of Maine, and also how to make bee houses, and also plants that are great for bees that I will send off to everybody. And if there's any questions, I'll take them if we have time. I don't know what time it is.
That was great, Jen. It's 7:53. I know people, have busy lives and all, but we do have some time for questions. So I would encourage people just to go ahead and unmute yourself or type something in the chat. And we did put a couple of resources in the chat too. For instance, the link to that bee checklist is in there. And also I put on something about where you can find a planting guide for gardeners that want to know what plants to plant for pollinators in your zip code. So
Great.
Go ahead. Yeah. Thanks, Jen. So let's open the floor.
We do have some questions in the chat, so I don't know if we could do some. I want to look at those at all, Jen, or I could try to read some to you. What do you think?
Yeah, if you see any, I have.
Well, one of them is about, am I not muted? Tick control and people spraying their yards and the edges of their yards with pesticides to control ticks. Is that a hazard for bee populations?
Yeah, so it can be depending on what is used and where it's used. So for the most part, bees are ignoring perfectly manicured lawns. So if you have a lawn that has been weed free, there's no clover, no dandelions, nothing in it. It's just a oasis. It's like my father's favorite type of lawn. It's how he keeps his lawn. It's like perfectly manicured. Nothing for bees to be interested in. They'll just fly right over that. So if there's tick management going in something like that, the impact is probably pretty low. But if there's a edge of the lawn that is being treated and those plants are in bloom and they're flowering, the bees may be visiting those, and that could be problematic depending on what's used. Typically, if you're hiring somebody to do that tick management on your property, they have to follow rules, and they're not typically allowed to. Most labels say you're not allowed to spray or apply pesticides to plants that are in bloom. That's a rule. And so if they are doing that, that is off label, and you should probably tell someone. But typically it hasn't been an issue yet. Most of the applicators are pretty careful when it comes to that. And one thing you can do is that if you have to do a treatment to a yard, is if you mow those flowers, if you do have a flowery yard with dandelions and clover, is to mow that before you do any application. That'll make it unattractive for bees, and that's a good strategy for keeping it out of there. So yeah. And Kathy, actually, you know a lot about ticks too. So do you have anything else to add? Oh, you're muted.
No, that was a good answer. I think people have to weigh the risks. You know, Lyme disease is nothing to mess around with either. And if people are really having issues with ticks, that sometimes, but it's always just be very judicious about it. You know, a single application, very well timed in late spring is the recommendation for this area up in Maine. And like you said, you know, mow the lawn so there's no flowering plants. That'll help to reduce the risk. So, yeah. There was another question in there about imported bumblebees and whether that threatens our native species.
So that's interesting. There's been a lot of research over the last couple of years looking to see whether there's any maybe pathogen spillover from imported bumblebees. So if they're being reared in a facility and they have viruses or some sort of pathogen, and then they're released out in the wild as we do, whether there's going to be any spillover of those pathogens into our native bumblebee populations or the native bumblebee populations. And there are some instances where we're seeing that. There are some that are inconclusive. So the jury's still a little bit out on that. So I don't know. that one's a hard one. So actually, Frank, are you still on? Maybe not. So
We just got
Yeah.
another question in the.
I'm still here.
Oh, here's Frank. Yeah. What about bumblebees? Are those ones that we bring in for pollination? Are they causing problems with our native bumblebees?
Well, I think you're right on when you said the jury's still out.
Yeah.
You know, Sarah Bushman did a 2-year survey at 50 different locations, 25 where commercial bumblebees were utilized, and historically, and 25 that were at least 5 miles away from any knowledge of commercial bumblebees ever being used. And we weren't really able to find any large loss in bumblebee diversity or numbers of species in areas that had been using commercial bumblebees for a while. But on the other hand, you know, the rusty patch, and then also the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is the other one that they're considering listing, both of those are very, very sensitive to nosema. And some of the dogma is that one of the commercial bumblebee companies shipped some Bombus impatiens from Eastern North America into the Netherlands. And they guessed that they picked up an extremely virulent strain of Nosema bombi, and then they shipped those bees back. And this virulent strain of Nosema bombi got out into the wild, and it was more virulent to these very susceptible bumblebee species in this group that the rusty patch is in. But I don't know if there's really hard evidence on that, but that's kind of the folklore in the bee community. It certainly, it's not folklore that there are some bumblebee species that are really, really susceptible to Nosema bombi. And even the Nosema serrani that honeybees get has shown up in some bumblebees too. So this whole thing about pathogen spillover, I think is quite concerning, but it's at this point, it's really hard to know how important it is.
Yeah. Oh,
So that's my 2
actually,
cents.
just to add to that, I just saw a talk today that Jay Evans gave from the Beltsville lab down in Maryland, and he just stepped down from the position, but he used to run all the bee diagnostics. So he did a lot of viral work, fungal Nosema work for honeybees, but also they did a bunch of stuff with native bees as well. And he was showing some data that they have collected over the last couple of years that picks up some of the viruses that we have in honeybees in bumblebees. So they picked up some of the viruses, very similar, but they're not finding that they're actually being infected, which is really neat to see, because they weren't sure at first whether it was causing some of the issues that we're seeing. But especially with the viruses, they were finding them in the bees, but they weren't being infected, if that makes sense. So sorry, I just saw it today. It was really cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have hypothesized that without a competent vector like varroa mite, a lot of the native bees probably won't be susceptible to a lot of these, at least the viruses that are, so-called honeybee viruses. So that's nice that he's sort of shown that to be the case.
Yeah. So this one's a good one. So the question was from Amy, and she asked if the native bee habitat hotels also create habitat for wasps. Yes. So that's one of the really great things about these honeybee houses, is that they actually also attract our solitary wasps as well. They nest in very similar areas. And if you are interested to learn more about wasps of Maine, I'm going to be giving a talk on them during the Ag Trade Show. So that's going to be, what's the date on that, Kathy? Is it the second week of January or third week of January? It'll be free, and just keep an eye out for the Maine Agriculture Trade Show. I'll be giving a talk on wasps. It's going to be a new one for me, so we'll get through it together. But we do get our solitary wasps also nesting in those sort of bee houses, and it's not a negative thing. So a lot of those wasps, just like our solitary bees, are really uninterested in, they're not big stingers. It's really difficult it's unusual to get stung by one of our solitary bees. It's the same for solitary wasps, unless you really manhandle them or get them caught in between, your elbows, your elbow skins. They're going to sting you then. But for the most part, they're pretty docile, because they have if you think about it, they have a very short period of time that they have to do all of their business, all their bee and wasp business. So they have to make a nest, collect all the food for that nest, and then lay their eggs. Those eggs need to hatch and consume that food. And they need to do all of that in a very short period of time, which is typically 4 to 6 weeks. So that's their whole adult lifespan, to do all of that business, get all their babies made, and food provided for them, and housing provided for them during that time. And so there's a difference between wasps and bees. So bees are primarily vegetarian. They eat pollen and nectar. Wasps are actually omnivorous. So they eat meat, and they actually prefer meat. That's their protein source, instead of it pollen. And then they do some nectar feeding and some sweet feeding. So they'll they'll feed on some nectar resources and a little bit of pollen, but primarily they are meat eaters. And the reason why we like to have wasps is that they are really great predators for a lot of our garden pests. So like, for instance, just like in honeybees, just like in bees, we have solitary wasps and we have social wasps. So social wasps are things like yellow jackets, bald-faced hornets, and those are the ones that we typically don't want to have around. Those are the ones that sting us. They defend their home. We get stung multiple times. It's unhappy for everybody involved. Those wasps are really great to have around because they require, to raise their young, a lot of food, and that means that they are going through your garden, pulling off all those caterpillars, all those grasshoppers, katydids, crickets, all that stuff, bring it back to their nests and killing them and eating them. So they're really, really great for that. But if they are stinging you, that's something you have to take care of. It's not safe. It's not pleasant. But if they're not, I always say leave them alone. With our solitary wasps, they do the similar thing on a smaller scale. So we have things like the cicada killer, which is a really large, beautiful wasp that we have in Maine that goes out and collects cicadas. And it collects those cicadas, and what it does is it stings them and paralyzes them. Then it brings them back to their nest, puts them underground, lays an egg on them, and that egg eats the paralyzed cicada underground and consumes it while it's still alive. So it's paralyzed, being eaten alive by the baby wasp, the young wasp. And so they're very great. There's wonderful predators to have in the landscape, but those solitary ones are usually very unlikely to sting. So yeah, so that was a question about those. Oh, and then Jeff, see, I answered your question. Why do we like wasps? Because they're great predators. So anyway, do we want to oh, yes, there's a lot of them. We want to take one more? You want to choose it, Hillary or Kathy?
One half of the question, I'm not sure that got covered from Amy's, was do wasps, so will the hotels create habitats for wasps that might also be a threat to honeybee colonies?
No, usually the ones that we have that threaten the honeybee colonies are going to be our large social wasps. So because they need a lot of food, so it's going to be yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets mostly that are going to be attacking honeybee hives. Because they need so much food, a honeybee hive is a really, really great, compact, intact place to get a lot of food. So that what the yellow jackets will do is they'll gang up on a weak hive and they'll pull all the brood out and often eat all the honey out of the hive as well and use that to raise its young. But so for the bee houses, most of those are going to attract our solitary. They don't have that large area that they would need to house all of those individuals in a social manner. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jen.
Yeah.
Awesome. So informative. So fun.
Yeah. So seriously, come to the WASP talk during the Ag Trade Show. I saw Kathy put that in there, January 19th to the 23rd. I think I'm talking on the Thursday in the morning, late morning. So if you can check it out. I don't know if they're going to be recording them, but they may be. So awesome. Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Frank. Oh, and Josh is here too. And Carla. Everybody's here.
I know, right? So everybody be sure and watch the Maine Entomological Society, MES Facebook page. That's where we put out announcements. So for the next seminar, which is, Hillary, you'll have to remind me, it's the first Thursday of January, I guess. And I'm not sure who the topic is that evening, but you're all welcome to join us again and look for the email from Hillary. We might be able to answer a few questions that we didn't get to tonight via that email too. So.
Oh, and also I'll put in a final plug too to become a member to the Maine Entomological Society. I've been a member since the beginning, since I first moved to Maine.